I have a question which I will preface with the context for that question. First, to thank him for his leadership. We have worked together as a team on this issue of gun violence prevention and the fight against terrorism abroad and at home. And I want to thank our other colleagues who will be part of this effort. It is very much a team effort that we bring to the floor today, involving our friend and distinguished colleague from New Jersey, Senator Booker, Senator Feinstein, who has worked so hard on this legislation before we arrived here, our colleague Senator Durbin, who's with us now, Senator Schumer, so many of us who feel so deeply. And I think for Senator Murphy and myself, the deeply emotional experience of Orlando evoked the images and sounds and sights of Newtown on that tragic day when both of us were there and witnessed the aftermath of 20 beautiful children and sixth grade educators gunned down senselessly, needlessly, in an act of unimaginable and unspeakable horror. This effort is more than about just words. This chamber is filled with words. Rhetoric is the business of the floor of the chamber. We're here today to seek action. And action has been too long delayed on preventing gun violence. And the kinds of acts of hatred and terror that happened in Orlando. Actions speak louder than words, and the nation deserves action. 90% of the American people want sensible, common sense measures like background checks to be adopted by the Senate. There is no question that we are learning more in shock and horror about the details of Orlando. It seems to have involved potentially insidious bigotry and hatred, a pernicious extremist ideology, perhaps inspired by ISIS and others abroad, as well as very likely mental illness of some kind. But we know it was an act of terror and hatred that can be prevented by the kinds of measures that we are seeking today. Specific measures, preventing anybody who's too dangerous to fly in a plane commercially to buy a gun. No fly, no gun. Someone who is deemed to be a terrorist or deserving to be on the terrorist watch list should also be deemed too dangerous to purchase the kinds of weapons that this individual was able to purchase. And to strengthen the FBI, because its investigative authority, in effect, perhaps not legally, but in effect, would have been strengthened by this kind of measure, enabling anybody too dangerous to fly to also be stopped from buying a gun. And this individual could have been stopped. Not with any certainty can we say it here, but at least that possibility realistically is there, and its investigations might have been continued and pursued had that law been in effect. And of course, background checks are a means to enforce existing laws and prevent categories of people already deemed too dangerous to buy guns. Convicted felons, or drug addicts, or others in those categories adopted literally years, decades ago, with full support of the opponents of background checks who may be in opposition now. These measures complement each other. And we know that we must fight terrorism abroad. We are at war against ISIS. We must pursue that war effectively and aggressively and relentlessly. And we must fight the homegrown terrorists who are either inspired or supported by ISIS, the lookalikes and soundalikes that claim allegiance to ISIS, whether they are supported or inspired, and for whom ISIS may claim responsibility. And the defenses must be hardened at home. That is part of what we are seeking to do here, just as we fight abroad against terrorism that would reach our shores and threaten our security. Those measures must involve some military action, and that military action will include intercepting intelligence and finances, air superiority and air aid for our allies on the ground without committing massive numbers of U.S. troops to that effort. That war must be pursued even as we pursue the war against terror and hatred here at home. But hardening our defenses requires this kind of action. And so we must commit as a body to stop the terrorist gap from continuing to threaten our security at home, as well as implementing universal background checks that will keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people. We owe it not only to the memory of the children and educators at Sandy Hook and the countless innocent people who have perished since in the mass shootings that so preoccupy our attention, but also the daily shootings, 30,000 of them every year in downtown Hartford and around Connecticut. No place is immune. No one is safe so long as there is this threat. These measures are modest and they should be followed by others, such as a repeal of PLACA, protection against domestic violence victims in the kind of measure I've offered, the Lori Jackson Act. The repeal of PLACA, which my colleague from Connecticut and I have championed, would repeal the immunity that is unique to the gun industry. A ban on illegal trafficking and straw purchases, mental health initiative, school safety steps. These kinds of measures must be pursued as part of a strategy to combat gun violence and terrorism, whether it is inspired by ISIS or an organization abroad or homegrown here. These measures are complementary and they must be pursued together. We have lived too long, and I have worked literally for decades since I first supported a ban on assault weapons in Connecticut in the early 1990s, and then defended it in court after it was adopted. These measures of protection will require steps against those kinds of assault weapons that are truly weapons of destruction, designed to kill and maim human beings as quickly as possible, as many people as possible. Those assault weapons, whether they were involved in Orlando or not, or any of those other examples, such as Aurora and Virginia Tech and Sandy Hook, clearly presented threats and implements of destruction there, and we must take action. We must come together. We must unify as a nation to recognize the common threat rather than divide ourselves with the kind of demagoguery that has been all too common in the wake of these tragedies. And so I asked my colleague a question, and I look forward to continuing to ask questions and working with him as part of this team today to continue the pressure that we feel must be brought to bear at this moment of national crisis, when a conscience of the nation can be evoked, when we all owe it to ourselves to search our consciences and conviction and look ourselves in the mirror and look the nation in the eye and say, we must act. We cannot allow this moment in our history to pass without action. I asked my good friend and colleague, Senator Murphy, if he can understand why this body has so long refused to recognize the will of the nation, why for so long the Senate has been, in effect, complicit by its inaction in these kinds of killings, 30,000 a year. What about the influence of the gun lobby has made it so powerful in exerting this hold over the United States Congress and many of our state legislators? And what can we do to address this public health crisis? It is more than just an epidemic. It is a public health crisis, a scourge of gun violence that we must counter. If 30,000 people died as a result of Ebola or Zika or some other disease, the nation would be rightly outraged. There would be drastic immediate action. Why not for this public health crisis and this epidemic that is not only threatening but deadly to our nation?
I thank my colleague for the question, and I want to reiterate the nature of our partnership that he underscored. He and I were there together in Newtown in that firehouse hours after that shooting, and we've spent probably hundreds of hours with the families since then. We've probably spent hundreds of hours together on this floor arguing as a team for changes in our laws. And so I'm so grateful to Senator Blumenthal, my friend, for being part of this effort today. And he is right in stating that long before I was, shall we say, a convert on this issue myself, in the days and weeks following Sandy Hook, it was Senator Blumenthal as our Attorney General and then as our Senator who has been fighting this fight for years.
And I want to follow a question that was asked by our colleague from New Jersey, and in fact, I've heard him speak so eloquently about the people in his city of Newark, in fact, children dying in his arms as victims of gun violence. Those kinds of acts of violence are unpredictable. The FBI was investigating the killer in the Orlando tragedy, knew of his potential dangerousness, but there are countless individuals who commit these acts of murder. 30,000 deaths every year occur as a result of gun violence, many of them unpredictable and perhaps unpreventable under current law, but which could be prevented with stronger laws. And so my question to my colleague from Connecticut is whether this measure will enhance the fact-finding and investigative powers of the FBI in seeking to stop gun violence where we know it may occur. And in fact, as much as I respect, and I deeply respect, the diligence and dedication of the FBI, whether additional resources combined with this kind of measure will enhance their ability to stop these acts of hatred and terror such as we saw so tragically in Orlando.
So thank you, Senator Blumenthal, and I want to thank you for your work on the Judiciary Committee leading this fight to try to make sure that law enforcement has what it needs to protect this country.
And we need to be realistic, don't we, Senator Murphy? As the President has said, we're not going to prevent every death from gun violence. And I think we owe the president a great debt of thanks for his leadership and his courage and strength in advancing the debate on gun violence and seeking specific constructive steps that will help to stop it. But we know that we're not going to be successful in preventing every single death as a result of gun violence. This kind of set of measures is a start. My colleague from Connecticut has said it's an easy start. It is easy to understand, and it's easy to see the effect and the tangible difference that it can make. But obviously, if it were easy to achieve, it would have been done long ago. And unfortunately, as he and I have said all too often, and as we have had to say to those families from Connecticut and around the country who have come to us at the vigils and the town halls and public meetings and in our offices, that there is no one single solution, and Congress has been complicit by inaction on any solution to this problem. And so we're not going to completely prevent all 30,000 deaths or every act of potential terror and hatred like Orlando. But we can make a start, can't we?
Senator Blumenthal, through the chair, that's exactly right. Let's make a start.
I want to just pursue some of the questions, the excellent inquiries that have been posed by our colleague from West Virginia, and just say that some folks out in America who may be listening or watching or may hear afterward about this debate may say to themselves, somebody who's been put on that watch list erroneously, someone who is precluded from boarding a plane or traveling in the United States, regardless of whether they can buy a gun or not, aren't they entitled to the due process right to correct that list? And the answer, in my view, is very simply yes, as a matter of constitutional right and due process, as a matter of equal protection, as a matter of the right to travel freely in the United States of America. If someone is on that list erroneously, he or she deserves the right to have that record corrected. And I'm going to pose that question to my colleague from Connecticut now, but also a second question, also probably on the minds of a number of our Connecticut constituents who are watching or listening or may hear about it afterward. Don't we have some of the strongest gun violence protection laws in the United States of America? And isn't that enough? Why are we worried about this terrorist watch list? Why are we worried about background checks for the nation as a whole when Connecticut has helped to lead the nation? When Illinois, as a matter of fact, has strong gun laws, perhaps in theory? When California or other states pass their own laws? Why are we here on the floor of the United States Senate seeking action, saying enough is enough? Why are we so outraged and passionate about achieving gun violence protection, barring people on the terrorist watch list from buying guns, making sure that we have universal background checks and a ban on straw trafficking and illegal importation across state borders? And I think the answer is these measures are necessary because even the strongest state laws are basically ineffective, at least to protect many people, as long as stolen guns, lost guns can be transported across state boundaries. Guns have no respect for state boundaries. And we in Connecticut are vulnerable because of the weaker laws in other states. And so this national protection is vitally important. Is that not the case, Senator Murphy?
Yeah, thank you, Senator Blumenthal, for that. I think that's critically important here.